excited to get started. We're going to talk about in this new year some new cybersecurity headaches. I know that both David and I are really excited to talk to you about a few of the breaches, and we'll probably cover a lot of our usual segments. We'll start out with talking about some good news. Hopefully, nobody forgets. We do always like to cover some of the positive things that happen in cyber. We'll jump into the danger zone and talk about some things that you might need to be worried about. Mention some of those vulnerabilities, and then we're definitely going to have some time today to answer some questions from the audience. And with that, if it's all right with you, David, I think we should get started. In our first segment, is there any good news? We do always cover something positive that's happening in cybersecurity, whether that's an arrest, in today's case, an apology, or even some sort of new task force or regulation that's coming down in cyber. Lockbit, they actually were able to give one of their victims a decryptor as it resulted in an impact that they hadn't intended. This isn't one of the first times that we've seen a ransomware gang or its affiliates sort of come out and apologize for a particular organization being victim of attack. David, if you remember, I actually feel like maybe it was a little less than a year ago, we sat here and talked with our audience about, it might have been Dark Side or Black Matter, but that they sort of had a rule of ethics too, right? And they might have targeted some sort of infrastructure, or maybe it was a educational institution, and they came out and said, we're sorry, that actually wasn't us. It was one of our affiliates that uses our software. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think so. With these ransomware gangs and ransomware as a service, there are often a lot of affiliates that take advantage of the same software, the same ransomware as a service, and it seems like there's not a lot of centralized control over what the affiliates are doing. It looks like.
Yeah, and before you go and starting a GoFundMe for the Lockbit group, let's not forget they do successfully ransom a lot of organizations and sick kids, though. They did eventually get a decryptor, did experience downtime, outages, and delays in patient care as a result of this attack.
So in other, I guess, good news, the fine for the Cambridge Analytica leak came through. If you remember, this was a while ago. I guess it was 2018 or so. Facebook allowed a researcher to install an app that siphoned off the data from like 87 million users or something, that was then used apparently in the election and to target different advertising to different folks, or different messaging to different folks. It's interesting, I guess Facebook has had to pay a lot of fines. Looks like between this, it's well over 5 billion that they've had to pay. I did a quick check. It looks like they have over 40 billion in cash on hand as of the end of the year, so they can probably manage it. But it's not nothing there with all these fines for all the privacy violations.
And monetizing data is becoming a big business, is it not, David? I mean, whether it's the data you collect from your consumers and then sell to other businesses, or the data that you sell B2B, this probably isn't the first time. Just probably one of the kind of bigger names that's really becoming a victim of this, where we might see large organizations potentially mishandle the data that they've been entrusted with.
Yeah, it reminds me of the phrase, if you're not paying, you're the product. And shout out to Kate there, who did a quick calculation. If everybody in the class action applied to get reimbursed, it looks like they could each get about $8.
Yeah, and I guess I'd ask our audience this question, is that enough? One of the questions we always like to ask is, does the crime, fit the time? Or I guess in this case, does the violation fit the fine? Definitely something worth thinking about. Now, there is one last bit of good news, and that is that an alliance has been formed, the International Counter Ransomware Initiative, with global membership, including some of the places that some of our audience members have dialed into today, really targeted around information sharing and improving the resiliency against ransomware for governments, government entities, and businesses that do business in each one of those member countries. Now, this isn't the first time that we've seen a task force get formed or some focus being put into ransomware. The thing that I'm always wondering, and David, I'll ask you this question is, you think this is going to be different? Do you think we'll see this make a broader impact than potentially some of the focuses around ransomware in the past?
Well, it's definitely better to pay attention than to not pay attention. And I think if we have the transformers on our side, then we're more likely to succeed.
If they can figure out maybe Chat GPT could do this, how we could use Optimus Prime in the fight against ransomware. I do think we might get the upper hand, and hopefully I got that right. If that maybe I didn't. So let's jump on into the danger zone, and let's talk about some of the the cyber attacks that really should have you at least raising an eyebrow.
Definitely. We saw two crypto crimes recently, one with a miner that was compromised and one with a wallet that was compromised. BTC.com is a mining pool. I think it's like the seventh largest in the world, apparently. Didn't get a ton of information about how the breach happened. Looks like the about 700K of the client crypto was stolen, and the rest of it was assets owned by the company. And they're working on recovering it and getting everybody's crypto back, and also patching and doing more to make themselves more resilient to attackers. The BitKeep one was a little more interesting, I thought, from what we learned about the attack. BitKeep is a crypto wallet. It's decentralized, and both has all the crypto buzzwords there if you go and you take a look at BitKeep. But apparently the victims, they woke up the day after Christmas and they noticed that their crypto was gone. They had downloaded a Trojanized version of the wallet software. It was, I guess, it was like an RPK packager. It wasn't an RPM. It was a Linux distribution that I think is, on Android. But they'd had a Trojanized version of this package downloaded, and those were the versions of, or those were the victims, right? So they had all downloaded. If you downloaded a Trojanized version of your bank software, you wouldn't be surprised if somebody was listening in and potentially could make it easier for them to steal your data. But I don't think those victims are necessarily going to be getting any of their crypto back because they started off with a Trojanized version of BitKeep.
You might even say that they didn't have such a Merry Christmas. Now, I'm sure everybody has been talking about, the internet has absolutely been a buzz about the LastPass breach. And I think this is going to have very far-reaching implications. Like anytime we see a credential manager get used in a breach, more and more, one of the cornerstones of an attack is, some sort of password spraying, where attackers are going to guess usernames and passwords. They're going to make an attempt, if they know the usernames already, to use existing and well-known passwords in order to gain access to a user account. And for one of our audience members, they knew exactly where we were going. Yes, Justin, it is time to talk about LastPass. And one of the things I think that this really sparks for is just the need for, using strong passwords. It brings up the debate around, and one of our audience members asked this too, around passwordless authentication, which has its pros and cons. But the downstream impact, we often see users who either use their passwords over and over again, or they use some sort of password schema. And David, I know how passionate you are about a lot of the AI and the ML technologies. And so what it made me think is, what if I took a user's password list and I threw it to Chat GPT and I said something like, what do you think their next password is going to be? I imagine I might actually get a decent guess of a result. And we might even see AI start to be used looking at a LastPass dictionary and generating, potential likely passwords for a user, maybe for a username and password combo that wasn't stored in their LastPass wallet.
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept, especially for folks that use a password schema. I don't know if Chat GPT would be trained to do it. I would hope that Chat GPT, if it was able to predict the next password, it would send it to you in a password protected file. But I'm not sure whether that's going to be.
And then how would we get the password? I mean, it's kind of would be like a passwordception at that point. Now, LastPass isn't the only one with password challenges. The OIG, or the Office of the Inspector General in the US, the Department of the Interior. It's a rather novel password attack. They hired a security team. They spent about I think the exact number was $15,000 on a decent computer. Right, we're not necessarily talking supercomputer or what's the other types of computers that's got everybody worried right now? Quantum computers probably cost a little bit more than 15K, but they were able to crack a large number of passwords for employees of the Department of the Interior. Now, what do you think the most used password was that they discovered in the attack? One of our audience members guessed password 1234, but switching the A out for an @ sign and adding an exclamation point at the end. Unfortunately, they did not try that hard. Password 1234, just as you see it on the screen, was one of the most common found passwords in the attack. Now, you combine this with like the LastPass breach, you start to get the idea that some of the most commonly used passwords might be a great place for an adversary to start, and might also be a great place for you to make sure your users aren't starting.
Yeah, there was some comedian did a shtick on this. It's like you got to use a number 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 1, you have to use a special character. You have to use a capital. It's pretty much the evolution of all of our passwords, and isn't evolving very far, unfortunately.
Now, we'll launch our first poll here. The question is, are you confident in password managers? And I think we should take this question while we're giving the audience a chance to answer here, which is, should you let the password utility generate your passwords?
I definitely feel like there's a vector there if you can figure out, if it's not totally random, and it's hard to make things totally random. I'd be curious to know how many people insert another password that they know into their like LastPass generated passwords.
So they salt their random generated passwords.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then I guess if your password database got breached, though, they'd figure out your salt pretty quickly, or at least the theme that you used for the salt. I'm not so sure about that, but our audience actually seems to be losing confidence in password managers. So probably a pretty pivotal moment. I think if we asked this question a year or two ago, we probably would have seen a little bit closer to 50-50. Now, in addition to the breaches that we saw, two that really stood out to me that also undertone a big focus in security on, DevOps and DevSecOps and cloud automation, where, both Slack and Okta had private GitHub repositories stolen. Now, what this means is that, GitHub is a external website. It's an external service. You can host things like GitLabs internally in your organization, but you can also use the enterprise versions like right from github.com. And so for Slack, attackers were able to gain access to several employees' tokens into GitHub. We talk about this in one of our attack sims we call Cookie Thief. I'm sure one of our marketing co-hosts might be able to dig up a webinar that Varonis did on that if our audience is interested in learning more about that attack vector. Or that might be a good reason to ask for a follow-up from today if that's something that you're passionate about or want to learn a lot more about. And what happens is those attackers, they get access to that token. It's sitting in memory, just like a password hash for your Active Directory domain account on your computer. And then they're able to replay those authentication tokens until what's called the TTL, the time to live, expires. This allowed attackers to get access to private code behind Slack. Now, I think what's important about this isn't so much that, Slack is so ubiquitous. It's on so many different people's computers. A lot of people use it. It is just a chat tool, but it makes me wonder about could they find a hook in? Could they potentially have altered the code? They only said that they took the code. We really don't know a lot about, what downstream implications of this could be. And I think, the Okta having that same issue, though they didn't necessarily comment on how the attackers got access to the private source code. This is where I start to question, are these attackers gaining access to code that they're now going to be able to review and find vulnerabilities in that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to? Like we see when every time a new Windows kernel level vulnerability exists and that kernel level function is tied into like hundreds of different applications or browsers or different things that happen at runtime on your machine. And will this lead to more breaches, right? Will this lead to both Slack and Okta having more vulnerabilities potentially discovered by attackers or security researchers before these stories start to die out?
It sort of makes you wonder what other weak links could be found and then exploited a little bit later by having this. Matt. What day is it, Matt?
Um, it's National Milk Day, right? Isn't today the first day that we, in the United States that they started to do milk delivery? I think I'm getting that right. Or can I not see over the hump of the question here?
That's correct. It is National Milk Day. But speaking of insurance, I thought it would be good to kind of mention this kind of quote from it was actually Mario Greco, who was the chief executive at Zurich Insurance, who is basically saying, he cited some of the recent attacks that have disrupted some of the hospitals and the pipelines and government, and kind of said, this is the risk we need to be worrying about, or one of the big risks that we need to be worrying about in terms of insurance, because they're going to become uninsured. They had initially denied $100 million claim after NotPetya, which, that was one of those huge, big ransomware attacks that was I guess a few years ago now, but they've since settled. But I think Lloyd's has started doing an exemption for state-based attacks, but then, that's kind of a slippery slope, because so much of the state actors and the ransomware gangs are starting to become hard to tell the difference there. So I think this is an interesting statement. I don't know what the audience thinks about this in terms of the insurance. And, one of the suggestions is the government may need to step in here, because there's so much critical infrastructure, so much critical data. We're so dependent on all of the computing infrastructure. It seems to be behind almost everything. The costs when things go down can be pretty uninsurable and pretty big rather. And speaking of that, thought it would be good to kind of give an update on this morning. It doesn't look like the outage this morning so far was related to a cyber attack, but speaking of costly things to insure, right?
Yeah, and not just that, but I want to ask our audience a question on this one, and not necessarily a poll question, but when we think about a disruption to a service, right? Like this system having a system failure, how much do you as a security practitioner or an IT practitioner focus on just pure availability and systems resilience versus thinking about how do I defend the system from attack? Oftentimes I see this as one of the areas where there tends to be quite a debate around whose responsibility it is to keep the application up and running and highly resilient versus whose responsibility it is to keep it from attack. So if you could share with us in the chat, where that responsibility sits in your organization, we'd be really curious to see, just kind of the diversity of the answers there as far as, keeping things running. This wasn't the only disruption to flying in recent weeks, by the way. I think another airline or another organization had a real issue with their technology being available in order to route bags and schedule flights. Personally was impacted by that over the holiday season. I'm sure some of our viewers were as well.
Yeah, it's been a rough few weeks. Apparently today you could land safely, but you couldn't take off because of the NOTAM alerts, which I learned was short for notice to air mission. It used to be short for notice to airmen, but they've updated that term. Those things, that's what you need to take off, right? So at least people were able to land today safely.
And a few people in chat saying that infrastructure and operations is really where they should shoulder the burden of availability. Now, when we talk about availability, you can't talk about that and not talk about ransomware, right? You can't unbreach data. In a ransomware attack where they steal the data, that's not something that you can undo. But if your organization gets impacted past that, where you lose availability, you lose the ability to deliver care to your systems, and I think that the dangerous trend here is not every ransomware group cares who the target is. For the Hive ransomware gang, who, if you were following us in our last episode, we talked a lot about how they were targeting organizations in Australian government entities. I think that's one of the reasons why Australia was really trying to lead the charge towards a ransomware task force. We're now starting to see them pop up in the South, inside of the United States, and specifically targeting healthcare organizations. The trend here, we always ask about Everyone wants to talk about cybersecurity predictions for 2023. And I always think back to, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, this year. The more and more that systems become interconnected and our lives become dependent on technology, the more I predict, just to throw one of our predictions out there, that we're going to see more impact to our day-to-day lives because of technology outages, whether that's impact our ability to get on an airplane or receive care at a medical center. No longer is it really just about where you might see or feel things, but it's also going to be about the infrastructure behind our day-to-day lives, as these ransomware groups don't seem to care who they're targeting.
Yeah, it's when it comes to the the availability there and the exfiltration risk and obviously the tampering of patient data you have to be worried about too. This is sort of I think it, when it comes to responsibility of all the kind of angles of the CIA triad, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. It starts to be a big set of jobs here, right? So
one of the reasons that some of these attacks happen are because of vulnerabilities. So we should probably jump on to our next segment and talk to you about some of the recent vulnerabilities that you should be aware of.
Yeah, this one was kind of scary. Comcast Xfinity multi-factor authentication bypass. Apparently, this is it looks like it's another two-factor bypass. It's similar. It reminds me, some of our research identified a vulnerability in Box a while back that was on our blog. We can probably put the link in the chat there, but it's kind of dangerous because somebody that uses the Xfinity email solution, they had a secondary email applied to their account, and so that's kind of for those people that use that Xfinity email to as the destination for their other services, right? It can kind of have this domino effect. Once your email is compromised, and an attacker can use this multi-factor authentication bypass. And apparently they did that with credential stuffing, right? They guessed the password and they did the multi-factor bypass. Then they have access to your email. Then they can look at your email, see what other services you're subscribing to from that email, and then go try to reset the password on those as well. And get into there. So it's I hope everybody's doing multi-factor on all the downstream services too, but it's pretty dangerous, that combination there.
Now, in addition to the vulnerabilities that we saw from Comcast, I think you can't not mention that the data leaks that come from profile data being leaked from things like Twitter, or things like email addresses that show up on Have I Been Pwned. These are all of the ingredients. We really have covered the perfect storm of ingredients today for password attacks. If there is like one thing that you walk away from this session from today, it's like, what's your plan for that? The usernames are out there. The passwords are out there. We all know that everybody likes to reuse those or, tweak them a little bit for the sources that they use. We can't talk enough about, like, as David just said, just to say it again, or retweet it, as they like to say, the importance of multi-factor authentication, as well as just the monitoring of those user identities and then the data and the systems that you're trying to protect, because it's clear that, the path is there for an attacker to take advantage of. That this vector has become very easily exploitable with the abundance of usernames and passwords that are out there on the web.
Yeah, you cannot count on those. And it looks like we may have some other danger on the way with Patch Tuesday here, right? There's a new zero day that may be actively being exploited at the moment.
Yeah, I was just reading about that earlier this morning, as it seems like that it also affects the Chromium, formerly known as Edge browser, right?
Yeah, which is becoming a bit more popular and I think Microsoft is encouraging its use, right?
Yeah, when I tried to join a meeting the other day, I got because I clicked on the link from Teams, I got a prompt to not open it in Chrome, which is the default browser on my phone, but it got to open it and install an application to make sure that it opens in Edge or Chromium so that it can then redirection, just all this layers of software integrations. You can only imagine how that opens the door for vulnerabilities and exploits to take the way. I don't know that I've seen a kind of a big breach where this was one of the sources of that yet. But I anticipate if you hear from us in the next couple of weeks about having another urgent episode, it will probably be about this.
Yeah, these vulnerabilities have a way of haunting us. I just think of how many times we've talked about proxy shell over the past couple of years, even though how old is that vulnerability now?
I can't even remember when we did our session about that. I'd have to ask one of our co-hosts to dig through the varonis.com/webinars, I think it is, and see which one it was where we started to talk about proxy shell. Now, we have gotten a couple of really awesome questions in the chat so far today. How reliable are these password managers, whether offline, online, web-based? Like, is this something that either we, individual persons should use, our corporations should use, we should endorse the use of? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's you never want to introduce a single point of failure. I feel like a password manager is certainly better than a Word doc in OneDrive, right? That's shared with everybody in the company, for example, which of course we find, especially for administrative stuff, it can be really, damaging. So I always try to consider the alternative. But and as a single point of failure goes, it's better obviously than a clear text, document. And if you've got, layered on multi-factor outside of it, I guess the question is, what else are you supposed to do at this point? I think, if you can do stuff that you can remember, then are you actually going to be able to remember where you put the special characters, right? Or where you put the capital letters?
Yeah. And
go ahead.
And just two of our audience members were thinking along the same line that I was, which is, and shout out to Kelby and Fott. I hope I pronounced your name right. We may be back to the old school notepads, and it makes me wonder, like, is a written password safer at this point, than all of this digital password files that in places that you store these passwords out on the web? I don't know that I want to take a stab at answering that, but it certainly makes you think about that. And it also makes you think about another question. It seemed a couple people in the chat were popular about this one. Like, is it time to think more about passwordless authentication? Now, I want to take an answer at this one. There are some keys out there and hardware passwords that you can buy. But right around New Year's, Christmas time, I was reading a really well-known security researcher. I'm not sure if it was Black Hills InfoSec or another one, who actually weaponized one of those. So they were able to take a user's hardware token key type password, like a stick sort of thing, and they flashed a new operating system on it to load malware and run code when they put it into their machine. So it's kind of like we'd be trading one evil, which is easily guessed passwords, for another threat vector, which would be getting our users accustomed to plugging in unknown sticks into their computers. And I think, that's really, I don't know if one is better than the other, or if the world is really ready for passwordless authentication, mainly because how many times a day we see MFA just work. Like we catch someone trying to do MFA, overload attacks, or I always called it a denial of sleep attack, when you send them a million MFA requests in the middle of the night. These things are ways that organizations catch attackers who have guessed a user's username and password before they're able to gain access to data or gain access to critical systems. And so I'm not sure we're ready for to bypass that yet. I think we're still at the point where we need to keep users educated and be aware when their passwords get leaked, and encourage them to rotate them and use multi-factor authentication. But there really is no shortcut for having to monitor the things that you care about, the data, the systems, the applications, the places where your organization keeps their crown jewels. And there's really no shortcut for just knowing that it's safe. You can't really just trust any one security control to be the one all, end all be all security control.
Yeah, and think ahead to what happens when it fails. Have you been seeing any of these TV shows where they take somebody's phone and just hold it up to their face, and then they're in the phone, and if that's your only authentication mechanism, and it's just, that's biometric, right? It's supposed to be better than passwords, but it's you just can't count on any of them.
It reminds me of I don't know if it was a TikTok or a GIF or GIF. I hope I got that one right too, where they were in the store and it was one of those handheld registers, and the guy knew that his buddy had his credit card in his shirt pocket, and so he grabbed the handheld register from the merchant and he held it up to his buddy's shirt pocket, and then was able to charge the transaction to their credit card. I think the same thing might apply when we think about impersonating users and kind of passwordless like authentication.
Some people are asking how long it'll take to crack a password, and how reliable. Can you tell, or how reliable are the sites that estimate how long it would take to crack a password? That's a good one. I feel like one thing that's come out recently that we can say is that the password length, is should be what's the minimum, these days, like to kind of give yourself any
12
shot.
with 3 character complexity, with 3 or 4 character sets at least. So uppercase, lowercase numbers and symbols. You need at least 12 characters with uppercase letters, numbers and symbols. I think there's a lot of opposing schools of thought around this though. I think the real password guidance is use MFA and make sure you're keeping MFA enforced. That probably comes out more and more when we talk about password and password-based attacks than even the strength of your password policy itself.
Yeah, I even wonder if using multiple password managers is something that people are doing. Just although it gets a little bit hard to track everything.
This show is made possible by you, our viewers. We really appreciate you being here. We look forward to communicating with you, chatting with you, hanging out with you virtually. We hope that you'll join us for our next episode. And also shout out to David, the co-host. Really appreciate everything and all the discourse that we get to have. And I look forward to the show with you and our audience for 2023.